Welcome, Neogenians, to Dawn of the New Earth. Today we're answering the question, if God didn't create the universe, then what did? And if God did create the universe, then what created God? These are critically important questions, and we are going to be exploring them and answering them finally through logic and reason and understanding the true source of all reality, all existence. We're going to get started right away, but as always, please hit like and subscribe. My channel is about revealing hidden information to raise consciousness and create a new earth. And when you hit like and subscribe, it spreads this information around. So please take a minute to do it now. Let's see. I want to remind you that my new book is out. And if you like what we're talking about today, I highly recommend that you check it out. It's called Meta-Rationalism, The New Science of Mind. And it's going to go into the topics we're discussing here today in an immense amount of detail. It explains how this is a mathematical reality and how we can know that we are eternal beings through reason, through logic, through mathematics. So the link to that is in the description of my video, and the link to my first book is there as well. You can check them both out and follow my podcast on Spotify, Dawn of the New Earth. All right, so let's get right into it. If God didn't create the universe, then what did create the universe? You know, I'm an ex-Christian, and one of the questions I always ask, because Christians obviously say that God created the universe, well, then that begs the question, well, then what created God? And I always got the answer that, well, God is eternal. But how is it that God is eternal? And then I'm usually given the answer that, well, we can't know these things. God is beyond our understanding. He just is. But we're going to take a look at this in more detail. And when I left Christianity, I started to look into science. And of course, science says that reality began with a Big Bang, but they can't explain how that Big Bang got started. There's a lot of theories out there, but there's a lot of problems with every single one of them, like random quantum fluctuations. What does a random quantum fluctuation actually mean in the absence of existence? If you're claiming that something caused the Big Bang, then there's still an existence of some kind. That is a quantum random fluctuation. But what accounts for that random quantum fluctuation? What's the rational mechanism behind that? There's no answer given. So we're going to be exploring all of these questions and more. And to do so, I'm going to be taking a look and reading some excerpts from an article that is written on medium.com by, I'm pretty sure, an individual who is a Christian. They're religious in some way. They're a monotheist. I think they're a Christian. And this individual's name is Brian Tubbs. And they wrote the article called, If God Didn't Create the Universe, What Did? And so I'm going to be reading some quotes from this, some excerpts. And we're going to be taking a look at this because I think it's important to take a look at this because this individual is obviously religious and trying to give a religious explanation to things. And we're going to want to examine all this through logic and reason and see that religion is not correct, but scientific materialism isn't correct either. And people usually think it's either one or the other. But the problem is that neither of these answers are satisfactory. You go with religion and they go, God created the universe. Well, what created God? Well, I don't know. He's just eternal somehow. And then you go with scientific materialism and you go, well, what happened? It's like, oh, well, there was a Big Bang. Well, what caused the Big Bang? Well, maybe there was a quantum random fluctuation or something. And again, satisfactory answers are not given. We want true answers. We want rational answers. And we can understand that these two options aren't satisfactory because guess what? There's a third option. There's another option. And people always categorize like, oh, it's either religion or science, religion or science, religion or science. Well, no, that's not the case. There's more ways to understand reality, and that is understanding it rationally and logically. Scientific materialism is not about understanding reality rationally and logically. It's about understanding it empirically through the scientific method, through experimentation. Now, there is nothing wrong with the scientific method and experimentation when it's being applied to the physical world for pragmatic uses and technological advancements, finding medicine, things like that. But when you're trying to figure out what existence is, guess what? Physical methods fail because we're going to find out that reality is fundamentally immaterial. So it doesn't matter what kind of experiment you do. It's like, for example, doesn't matter how powerful your microscope is, you're not going to be able to see into the immaterial aspect of reality because it's not in this reality. It underpins this reality. But anyway, I digress. Let's start taking a look at this. We're going to see that both the answers provided by scientific materialism as well as the answers provided by religion are unsatisfactory, and finally discovering what created the universe in a rational way. So this individual's name is Brian Tubbs. Brian Tubbs says, recently, in response to one of my articles, a commenter smugly declared God didn't create the universe. Okay, so this individual, Brian's religious. He wrote an article. I don't know what the article is, but a commenter said God didn't create the universe. Brian says that was it. No explanation, no elaboration, no evidence, just an assertion. And I understand how annoying this could be, because I get assertions like that, like comments like that on all my videos and all the time, where people will just be like, no, you're wrong. And it's just like, okay, but if you're going to say that, that's fine. Like, I have no problem with people disagreeing with me, but at least give some kind of explanation or rationale behind why you're saying that. Anyway, Brian says, well, if God didn't create the universe, what did? It's a reasonable question. So remember, Brian is a monotheist, believes in God, and is basically going to show he's going to argue that God had to create the universe. But we're going to see that we can understand this to be incorrect, at least with regard to a theistic God. We'll see and unpack all this bit by bit. So Brian says, if the universe is infinite and eternal, then no creator is necessary. But if the universe had a beginning, there had to be a cause, not just any cause, but a cause sufficient to bring space, time, matter, and energy into being. So the important thing to note here is that Brian's saying, if the universe is infinite and eternal, then no creator is necessary. Why? Because something that is eternal has always existed. It's not something that ever has a beginning. Eternality means has always existed, will ever always exist. So notice that Brian is saying, if the universe is infinite and eternal, then no creator is necessary. But notice that this is being applied to the physical universe. Brian is basically saying, if the physical universe is infinite and eternal, then no creator is necessary. He's not saying all reality. Because if you were to say reality is eternal, well, then that would include any sort of creator being. So when we're talking about the physical universe and the physical universe not being eternal, then, and the reason why, and I think he's going to explain this in a minute, is that we can understand that the physical universe is not eternal. We can find a beginning point to it. But anyway, long story short, the point is, if something is eternal, it doesn't need a creator. Now, of course, you have to say how and why that thing is eternal, but given that something is eternal, assuming that something is eternal, then it doesn't need a creator because it's eternal. So Brian says, but if the universe does have a beginning, then there has to be a cause. And not just any cause, but a cause sufficient to bring space, time, and matter and energy into being. The scientific community acknowledges tantalizing evidence that we live in a finite universe that had a beginning. So basically saying that the evidence provided by the scientific community points to the fact that it seems incredibly likely that the physical universe had a beginning. Now, he continues by saying, the theory that our universe is just one of many cycles of expanding and contracting universes has been debunked. That's not exactly true. So there is the theory of cyclical universes. Essentially the idea that prior to this universe, prior to the beginning of this universe, was the end of a previous universe. And so the end of the previous universe was basically the beginning of this universe. And then when this universe ends, it will serve as the catalyst for the beginning of the next universe, and on and on and on. So in that way, an answer can kind of be given of like, oh, well, what began this universe? Oh, the end of the previous universe started this one. Of course, then you have the issue of turtles all the way down, though. Like, well, okay, then what started that? The one before it? What started before that? And you could just say, well, it goes back infinitely. But that's not very satisfactory. But anyway, when he says that they've been debunked, it means that there is a problem with these theories. But these theories only have a problem when considered from a materialist perspective. And usually this has to do with the concept of entropy. Okay, so I just want to say this idea of cyclical universes does have a problem when you take a materialist stance, the stance that matter is the only thing that exists. But I digress. Maybe we'll come back to that if we have time for me to explain that in more detail. It'll take a little long, but and then Brian says there is some support in the scientific community for the possibility of a multiverse, but this runs into some mathematical and logical difficulties. I don't see why multiverse is being brought into this. I'm not a proponent of multiverse, by the way. I completely reject multiverse because multiverse comes from the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. So real quick, let me just talk about multiverse for like 5 minutes here, and then we'll go back to the main topic because I want to make a point of this. Because a lot of people, I think, who follow my channel might believe in multiverse. And the reason why is because multiverse has become super popular in spiritual and new age communities. Because for whatever reason, new agers and spiritualists see multiverse as being like this enlightened position. And unfortunately, this happens a lot with quantum mechanics as well. A lot of new agers and spiritualists don't understand quantum mechanics, and they don't understand multiverse. And so they adopt these ideas without really knowing what they mean, and they think that they're spiritual because they're like, oh, well, quantum mechanics has something to do with consciousness, and multiverse, like, there's, it's just shows that there's more realities beyond this one. So it just, they seem like it's very enlightened. However, what we have to understand is that these positions are actually anti-spiritualist. They're materialist positions. So the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is where multiverse comes from. And essentially what this means is that for over 100 years now, quantum mechanics has baffled scientists. Scientists cannot understand the results that they get from quantum mechanics because it conflicts with the idea that reality is material. The ideas in quantum mechanics break the idea that reality is material. They don't comport. They conflict with each other. Quantum mechanics points towards something else. So they're trying, but of course, scientific materialists don't want to say there's an immaterial reality because that's outside of empirical validity. You can't physically test something immaterial because it's non-physical. So they don't want to say that something non-physical exists. So they're trying to explain quantum mechanics without appealing to something physical. And there's a problem in quantum mechanics known as superposition and collapse of the wave function. And to put it very succinctly, it's essentially the idea that in a certain interpretation of quantum mechanics, and I know this sounds crazy, but this is why quantum mechanics has proven so difficult for many scientists to understand, for pretty much all materialist scientists to understand, is that superposition, according to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is the most popular interpretation, which is if you watch any documentary on quantum mechanics, that's the one they're going to tell you, this Copenhagen interpretation. Superposition says that a particle, a fundamental particle, a particle has no defined state until the active measurement. So for example, what that means is, let's take an electron. That would mean that an electron or a photon, let's say you want to know where it is. Where is the electron? Well, according to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, it doesn't have a location. It has no defined location. It's only until you measure it that the wave function collapses the wave function, and it then has a specific location. It's also been said that the particle is everywhere and only collapses to a single position when you measure it. But that's not really accurate. It's more that the particle is nowhere. It has no defined state. It has no defined location until the active measurement. Now, of course, this sounds hard to understand, right? It sounds crazy. Well, scientists are trying to understand this and try to explain it. And they go, okay, how the heck is it possible that it seems like a particle has no defined location, and it's only until the active measurement that it takes on a specific location? And it also seems like the location or whatever property or whatever state it collapses into, it also seems random or probabilistic. Like sometimes it'll be here, sometimes it'll be there, sometimes it'll be, it's could be anywhere. It's random, it's probabilistic. So how the heck is this happening? Basically, so imagine you don't know where a particle is, you measure it to find out where it is, and let's say it appears here. Well, it appearing there is probabilistic, meaning it could have appeared here, but it didn't. It appeared here. So the question is, well, why did it appear here rather than there? This is where the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics comes in. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics basically says that there are branching universes that are generated for every possible state that that particle could take. So for example, when you say that, you measure it and the particle is here, well, how come it didn't appear over here? They're saying because it did, but in another universe. We exist in the universe where it appeared here, but there's another universe where it appeared in a different location. And so essentially many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics puts in an infinity of universes to explain why a particle is in one state rather than another. They go, there's a universe for every possible state. So you get an infinity of universes for every possible state. Now, the reason why, if this sounds hard to wrap your head around and hard to understand, it's because it's not logical. The only reason why it sounds so crazy is because they're trying to explain it in a way that denies an immaterial existence. So for example, let's say you're playing a video game and you want to know how the video game works. And I tell you, okay, figure out how the video game works, but you're not allowed to say anything about the programming code. You have to pretend that the programming code doesn't exist. Well, that would be pretty hard, wouldn't it? You'd get certain events in the game where one thing happens instead of a different thing. And it's like, well, what explains that is the code. The programming code accounts for why a thing is a certain way rather than another. But if you're not allowed to appeal to the code, then it becomes incomprehensible. Well, maybe there's a different video game for every possible event that could happen in the game. This is essentially what scientific materialists are doing. They're like video game characters that deny that the code exists. They say there's no such thing as the code. But then they're trying to explain how the game works, and they get all these confusing ideas and results because they're not using the code to account for it. So for example, in what we're talking about, superposition and collapse of the wave function, if you accept that there's an underlying immaterial, mental, mathematical aspect to reality, then there's no problem. Why does a particle appear here rather than there? Because every particle has an inner mathematical coding, meaning each particle has an inner mathematical trajectory, meaning it's being guided by an internal aspect. It's like the code. Essentially, the code of reality tells the particle to be here instead of here. It has a mathematical essence that determines its trajectory. Things are guided mathematically. And so you see, then you don't need to be like, oh, well, there has to be a new universe for every possible state. No, a particle is just in one state rather than another because it's determined by its mathematical properties. But scientific materialists don't want to say that those immaterial aspects exist. All right, so I digress. I think I've talked about that enough, but I just want to point out why many worlds interpretation, multiverse, actually stems from denying the immaterial and trying to force materialism in. Instead of accepting there's an immaterial layer to reality, they try and fix the problem by introducing an infinity of physical universes. So many worlds interpretation and multiverse is not an enlightened position. It's the position of rejecting the immaterial, the mental, the spiritual, and instead rejecting that and instead replacing it with an infinity of physical universes. So I just want to make that really clear, because it's a lot of ideas like this get just people in the New Age community just grab onto it and they start talking about really weird ideas like timeline hopping and going to different universes in the multiverse. It's like none of this is valid, and it's actually an anti-spiritualist stance. Anyway, we could talk about quantum mechanics all day long. By the way, if for those of you watching the replay, if you want more videos on topics like this, quantum mechanics, I'd be happy to make them. I love talking about this stuff. But let me know. Let me know if that's something that you would like to hear about. We could talk about all kinds of things related to quantum mechanics. But anyway, we're talking about what created the universe. Okay? So, the author here, Brian, right? Brian says, the prevailing view is that our universe began with a bang, a big one. Thus, the safest bet is to go with Neil deGrasse Tyson, who says, yes, the universe had a beginning. So that begs the question, how? So in a nutshell, seems like the universe has a beginning. How did it begin? Brian says, logic helps us figure out what's true or false. This is very important. So remember, what Brian is proposing here is that we use logic to try and figure out what's true or false. That's great. That's a great position to have. But we have to make sure that we apply that logic correctly. Let's continue and see what Brian says. Brian says the Kalam cosmological argument has been worded differently over the years, but here's the gist of it. 1. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause. 2. The universe began to exist. Conclusion. The universe has a cause. This is completely valid. Whatever begins to exist, this is essentially saying anything that begins has to have something to start it. The universe began, so the universe had something to start it. So the question is, what started it? What was the cause? And Brian says, now it should go without saying that a cause must be sufficient. This is important. What does sufficient mean? A sufficient cause means that it is enough to explain something. That everything that is required to explain something or cause that thing is there. And Brian says, it wouldn't work for me to say that the can of peanuts on my desk caused the universe. The can of peanuts doesn't have the capability to bring about the complex universe in which we live. So basically, a sufficient cause for the universe means you can't just be like, oh, well, peanuts caused the universe, because peanuts aren't a sufficient cause for they don't contain everything that is required to generate the universe. Now, this is a very important point. And I want to mention that in the Neogenian system, the very heart of our system is predicated on the principle of sufficient reason. And so in our system, everything that exists must have a sufficient reason for why it is the way that it is. Meaning that everything in reality has to have a sufficient reason. This is slightly different than sufficient cause. They're very closely related. But sufficient reason just means a sufficient explanation, not necessarily cause. Cause can be, in many cases, parts of it. But there has to be, basically for anything that exists, there has to be a rational explanation for how it exists in the way that it does. And you have to have a rational explanation for the rational explanation that you give as well. Everything has to be explained in a rational way. Sufficiently. So Brian says the cause has to be sufficient. And Brian says, what is sufficient to bring about space, time, matter, and energy? Well, the answer is a causal agent that is capable of creating space, time, matter, and energy. So Brian says this argument doesn't get you all the way down to the God of the Bible, or, for that matter, the God of the Quran, or the God of gods of any religious text. It just establishes that there is a force or agent that is capable of creating space, time, matter, and energy, Nevertheless, it is fair to describe this force or agent as God. So what Brian is saying is that the universe had a beginning, and the universe requires a sufficient cause for its beginning. And he's pointing out that this doesn't necessarily mean that the God of the Bible is true, because Brian is basically saying, well, that sufficient cause is God. But he's saying the argument, and this is a very important point, because what this argument does say is something caused the universe. And so a lot of religious people will say, oh, well, that means God created the universe. But what you have to understand is that this argument simply is saying that a sufficient cause exists to account for the universe. It doesn't say that this sufficient cause's name is Yahweh, who created the world in 7 days and has a son named Jesus and has a plan for your life. It doesn't say anything about this. It could be a completely total, unfeeling, impersonal force. That's the position of deism. But so that's important to keep in mind. But Brian here says, therefore, God created the universe. How we understand God is another matter. It's for another discussion. For now, I'm simply making the argument that God exists and is the creator of the universe. It's an argument for monotheism. A couple things here to say about this. Brian is saying, hey, this doesn't prove the God of the Bible. But according to Brian, it does prove that God created the earth or the world or the universe. What that means is something for another discussion, but regardless, it's an argument for monotheism. Now, I do have some problems with that. Is it an argument for monotheism? It's a bad argument for monotheism. Monotheism is the belief that there is one God and that this God is a personal God, has a plan for your life, has all these different attributes, all loving, all knowing, all powerful. It's a very personal God. It's a God that interferes supernaturally in the affairs of humans. The cosmological argument doesn't say anything, not a single thing about a monotheistic God. So it's a very bad argument for a monotheistic God. It's an argument for a fundamental cause, a sufficient cause, absolutely. And if you want to label that sufficient cause God, you certainly could. But is it an argument for monotheism? I mean, in the very most bare minimum way you could possibly say, because it's basically saying the cosmological argument says that there's a sufficient cause for the universe. To try and jump to monotheism by saying, well, the God of the Bible who sent Jesus to earth to die on the cross for your sins, is that sufficient cause? That is a huge leap. That is a monolithic leap. That is a chasm. That is a very far reach. So, but let's take a closer look at this. Okay. So did God create? Because the cosmological argument says that that there was a cause for the universe. Now, notice though, we are using logic and reason to examine this. This is what Brian is doing. Brian is saying, hey, I'm putting forward this logical argument to try and prove the existence of God. Now, does it prove a monotheistic God? No, but it proves that there's a sufficient cause for the universe. And so Brian is using logic and reason to make this claim. So one has to accept that logic and reason reveals truth. Because if you say, oh, well, logic and reason doesn't reveal truth, then I could just say, no, Brian, you're wrong. Why? I just say you're wrong. Because if I don't believe in logic and reason, I don't have to give you a reason. I don't have to give you a logical answer as to why you're wrong. I just, no, you're not. You're wrong. So Brian is using logic and reason, which is great, but we can't be wishy-washy about this. We have to see what logic and reason actually says about this. And so logic and reason says there is a sufficient cause for the universe. It doesn't say anything about a monotheistic God. Now, let's take a look at the idea of what actually created the universe. And I'm going to tell you right now, this is a complicated answer. But I'm going to do my best to explain it in a very short amount of time. But if you want a full, very lengthy explanation, it's in my new book, The New Science of Mind, Meta-Rationalism. Check it out. There is so much detail in there, you'll probably be like, please, no more detail. But it's very, everything is logically and rationally laid out. Okay, so according to our system, this is a mathematical reality. Mathematics is an expression of reason. It's a system of reason. It's a structure of reason. And reality operates according to the principle of sufficient reason, meaning that for everything that there is, every arrangement, everything that exists, there's a sufficient reason for why it is the way that it is. The reason why I'm pointing all this out is because Brian has affirmed that we can use logic and reason to understand reality, and I'm just bringing this back around to predicate that what we are talking about here is based on logic and reason. We believe that this is a mathematical reality, a logical reality, a rational reality, and that all things can be explained rationally and mathematically, that reason reveals truth. Now, if we understand this entire system, here's another way to put it. What created reality? Nothing. Nothing created existence. Now, when I say nothing created existence, or not existence, I'm sorry, the universe, meaning the physical universe, when I say nothing, I don't mean non-existence. Non-existence is the absence of existence. I'm not claiming that. I'm claiming that nothingness is the concept of zero. The concept of zero, within it, contains all mathematical values. Why? Because if you take all positive values and all negative values, it adds to zero. So zero isn't a state of emptiness. Remember, we're using logic and reason. Logically speaking, zero is something that contains everything. Zero is something that contains everything. Now, mathematics is not a physical substance. It's mental. It exists in the realm of thought. So this is a structure of reason, a structure of thought. You can think of it as being the code of reality. Now, this code of reality has the capacity to generate all existence. In other words, it's the sufficient cause of reality because you have infinite mathematical power. You have infinite mathematical values. And these mathematical patterns and these mathematical values can arrange themselves in such a way that they generate the universe. Now, how exactly is this done? I'll get to in just a minute. But before I do, we have to understand, and I'm going to explain why in just a minute, because the question is, how does mathematics generate the universe? We can understand that. But for the moment, there's one other thing that we have to account for, because people might be like, well, wait a minute, where did mathematics come from? If you're saying that the concept of mathematics that balances to zero is capable of generating all reality, well, then where did math come from? So conversely, let's think about the question of God. If you say God created the universe, well, I'm an ex-Christian, so this was a question I had growing up as a kid. It's like, okay, well, what created God? You're saying God created the universe. Okay, let's say that that's true. Well, what created God? Well, you get the answer that, well, God is eternal. And remember, something that is eternal doesn't need a creator. But that begs the question is, well, how is it that God is eternal? Remember, in our system, there must be a sufficient reason for everything. So what is it? What quality? What attribute? How is it possible that God is eternal? Sure, you can say that God is eternal, but logically speaking, how is that possible? And of course, the answer I was always given was that we can't know, that we're just mere tiny little stupid human beings and we can't possibly understand the nature of God. But somehow God is eternal. So you can see it's not a very satisfactory answer. You have God created everything somehow, and God is eternal somehow. Mathematically speaking, we can answer all of these questions. Remember how we're using logic and reason to determine truth? That's what Brian was doing, putting forth rational arguments to show if you follow logic and reason, it shows that such and such much must be the case. And if we're accepting logic and reason, then we have to follow this. If not, we could just throw everything out. So when we ask the question, where did mathematics come from? We have to look at it logically and rationally. And when we look at it logically and rationally, we discover that mathematics is eternal because logically it has to exist. So what this means is that we're using logic, we're using reason. According to the rules of logic and reason, it is impossible for mathematics to not exist. This is entailed in the concept of necessary existence. If something has necessary existence, it means it's impossible for it to not exist. How do we know if something is necessary? We can find out if something is necessary if its denial results in a contradiction. And when I say contradiction, I mean logical contradiction. So for example, let's take a look at the planet Earth. The planet Earth does not have necessary existence. It has contingent existence. What contingent existence means is that it does exist, but it wouldn't be impossible for it to not exist. And so if we deny its existence, it doesn't result in a logical contradiction. So the Earth exists, obviously. But if I say the Earth does not exist, that's not true, but it doesn't result in a logical contradiction. You could imagine a universe where the Earth didn't exist. Its existence isn't mandatory. It might not exist in the future. Its reality can get along without that existing. It just happens to exist, and it depends on other things for its existence. That's another feature of contingent things. It depends on other things for its existence. Now, something that is necessary, when you deny it, it results in a contradiction. So let's take a look at mathematics. Let's take the statement 2 + 2 = 4. If we deny it, 2 + 2 does not equal 4. Oh, well, that absolutely results in a contradiction, a logical contradiction. 2 + 2 has to equal 4. It must equal 4. And I did a whole video. Check out my video called Does Mathematics Prove God? Because I know a lot of people are going to be like, well, mathematics is invented. No, we can show that mathematics is not something that it is invented. It is a fundamental necessary truth of existence, and we're just discovering it. The particular notation that we apply to it, like the particular stroke of the pen that we use to draw the number 2 and the plus sign and the equality sign, those are all symbols that we chose. But the underlying fundamental structure of it, that is true and always true. And its denial results in a contradiction. So basically what my point is, when someone asks, where does mathematics come from? What created mathematics? The answer is that nothing created mathematics. It's eternal because logically, it has necessary existence because its denial breaks logic. Do you see what I'm trying to say here? This is really important, and it can be kind of confusing at first if you haven't thought about this stuff before. It's actually very, very simple, but it's hard to grasp because it's at the very boundaries of thought. So the idea here is that when we take a look at a statement like 2 + 2 = 4, remember, we're using, like Brian did, we have to remember what Brian did was say, hey, let's use logic to try and prove God. So we're saying that logic reveals truth. Logically speaking, remember, if logic reveals truth, logically speaking, mathematics must exist. The statements of mathematics must be true. They must hold, because if they did not, logic would break. Logic would be contradicted. There would be a fatal inherent flaw. And so the critical thing to understand here is that if we are saying logic reveals truth, which is what Brian is doing when he's using a logical argument to try and prove God, that means that logical conclusions are valid when we use it correctly. And mathematics is something that must be true. Because if it wasn't true, it breaks logic. 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. Wrong, incorrect, logic is broken. It's an impossible state. So and the reason why I'm repeating this a lot is because I know it can be confusing for people, but this is really important because when someone says, oh, God is eternal, how? Why? I don't know. We can't understand the mind of God. He's just beyond our understanding. But when you ask, why is mathematics eternal? There is literally a logical explanation. Mathematics is eternal because it must exist, and its denial would result in a contradiction. So, by logic, it has to exist. So, the fundamental substrate of reality is mathematics. Mathematics in terms of mind. Mathematics in terms of mind. And this is what underpins reality. This is what we call the source. So underpinning physical reality is a mental mathematical domain that we call the source. The source can be in states of symmetry, or it can result in an asymmetrical state. And do I have my Rubik's Cube? So imagine that this Rubik's Cube was solved. If the Rubik's Cube was solved, let's pretend that represents a symmetrical state. We have a solved Rubik's Cube and it's in a symmetrical state. Now, if we were to mess up the Rubik's Cube, this is now an asymmetrical state. However, if we think about mathematics, we know that the total result of the mathematical system is 0. The reason that the total result of the mathematical system is 0 is because it contains every possible value, meaning all possible positive numbers and all positive negative values, which results in 0. However, that doesn't mean that it's static, still, and unchanging. Infinite transformations and variations can take place while still maintaining a net result of 0. So imagine that we had numbers written on each of the squares here. Imagine we had like a +1 and a -1 and a +2 and a -2, +3, -3, +4, -4, +5, -5. For every positive value, for every positive number, we had a negative number. So if we were to do that, and then we were to add them all up together, what would the total result of this Rubik's Cube be? It would be 0. But you see, it's not this Rubik's Cube is not non-existence. It's just a mathematical structure that results in 0 in our little metaphor that we're doing here. So this would be, and that's why we have to understand the difference between nothingness and non-existence. 0 isn't empty. It's a state where every value contains its opposite as well. So like this Rubik's Cube would have had for every positive value, it also had a negative value. The total result of the cube would be 0, but it doesn't mean the 0 would vanish or disappear. It just means that it's structured that way. However, think about this. Even though the entire cube is 0, what can we do? We can rearrange the cube into different patterns. Now, let's say we do that. We arrange the cube into a different pattern. Well, what's the value of the whole cube now? It's still 0. It doesn't matter what arrangement you transform the cube to, whether it's solved or totally mixed up and everything in between, it's always going to equal 0. So the same thing goes for the fundamental structure of reality, in that it always is equal to 0 and is always self-sufficient Everything that it needs is contained within itself, but it can create infinite variations and transformations. And this capacity for infinite variation and infinite transformation is exactly what has the sufficient cause to generate reality. Because basically, not generate reality, generate the physical universe. Because basically what the physical universe is simply a specific transformation of mathematical pattern. It is a transformation of mathematical pattern that introduces difference, multiplicity, and separation. In other words, you are going from a state that is symmetrical and unified to asymmetrical and diverse. And this is what produces the illusion of the physical world, because the physical world isn't actually physical. It's not independent of mind. It is a product of mind. It's mind arranged in a certain way. It's mind arranged in a certain pattern. And so we have mind arranged in a certain way, mind arranged in a certain pattern that generates reality. And just because of time, we would have to get into exactly how mathematics expresses itself. So mathematics expresses itself in a very specific way. It expresses itself in terms of frequency patterns. And there's a lot of reasons for this. To give like a really brief overview, it has to do with the cyclical nature of reality and the fact that the perfect, most rational pattern is a cyclical one. And cyclical patterns are also expressed as sinusoidal waveforms. As soon as you have a circle, you also have sinusoidal waves. They go hand in hand. It's different ways of expressing the same information. So when you get circles, you get waves. So in other words, since we have the mathematical pattern of a circle that is possible, we also have the mathematical pattern of waves that are possible. Thus you get mathematical waveforms, mathematical sinusoids. Mathematical sinusoids can enter into a state of symmetry and phase, or they can be asymmetrical, where they are out of phase and have various varying amplitudes. When you have a state where all amplitudes are equal and everything is in phase, you have a realm of perfect mind, because there is no difference. However, when these waves go out of phase and vary in their amplitude, then the physical world is generated, because now you have a world of that. All physical reality is based on difference. I am here, you are there. I am short, you are tall. I am, whatever, you get the idea. Everything is based on difference. This is how we are able to differentiate one thing from another. And so we have a world of difference and diversity, which is a great thing. It's a really good thing. Reality would be really boring if we didn't. We'd all be exactly the same and there'd be nothing to do. So reality is capable of generating all existence through mathematical pattern. And we know this because everything is described by mathematics. Everything formal in reality is describable by mathematics. Now, there is one caveat to this, and this has to do with experience. There is no mathematical formula that you can give that accounts for experience. However, reason accounts for experience as being the inner aspect or the experiential aspect of mathematical form, meaning that for every mathematical form that exists, there's an experience associated with this. And of course, there's a sufficient reason for this. This meaning this is because, remember, it's in terms of logic and what breaks logic and what doesn't break logic. Experience does not break logic as long as it behaves rationally. And mathematical structure is what provides the rational form for experience to be associated with to ensure that it behaves rationally. So it is capable of existing because there's nothing about it that violates the rules of reason as long as it behaves mathematically and rationally. And it does so because the formal structure of reality is there to provide that rational framework. So let's see. Okay, so we have the idea. So there's a couple of questions some people might put forward. Is they might go, okay, well, all that, okay, because if we're thinking in terms of logic and reason, we can't deny the eternal existence of mathematics. Well, someone might go, well, how do you know that God didn't use math to create the universe? Well, this brings in a plethora of problems, logical problems, such as, again, well, how does God exist? What is God? How does God exist? How is God eternal if you're saying that God is eternal? It is also a big violation of Occam's razor because mathematics contains within it the capability of generating reality. Mathematics contains within it the capability to generate the physical universe. Adding in a monotheistic God is a violation of Occam's razor. And the reason why is let me give you an example. Let's say that you see a horse pulling a cart. And someone asks, how is the cart moving forward? Well, because the cart is pulling it. Because the horse is pulling it. The horse provides the sufficient reason for the movement of the cart. So the sufficient reason, the sufficient cause. Why is the cart moving forward? Because the horse is pulling it. It would be a violation of Occam's razor to say, well, and also there is a team of 1,000 tiny invisible fairies pushing the cart forward too. So that's actually how it's moving. Well, see, that's a violation of Occam's razor because the explanation of the horse is enough. It fully explains the motion of the cart. You don't have to add in this other extra theory of invisible fairies. It's a violation of Occam. There's no reason to do that. So we can apply that same sort of logic to people who might be like, well, how do you know that God didn't use math to create reality? Because mathematics inherently within it has the ability to generate reality itself, just like the horse has the ability to pull the cart. You don't have to have God in there as an extra thing, just like the invisible fairies pushing the cart would be an extra thing. You don't need to put that in, and it adds a lot of problems. If you say that there are invisible fairies pushing the cart, where did those invisible fairies come from? How do they exist? What are those things? Same thing with you throw God in there. You don't need God in there. But if you do, how does God exist? How does God operate? How is God eternal? And of course, no satisfactory questions in terms of a monotheistic God can ever be given. And so we have the idea that mathematics in terms of a rational structure is possible, and it has the power to generate all reality. And we can understand, if you want to know a lot, like I said, my book, Meta-Rationalism, goes into excruciating detail on all this. And it goes into more detail about precisely how mathematics generates reality. And we can understand it in a simplistic sort of intuitive way by seeing that mathematics is infinite, and we can understand that everything is explainable by mathematics. So mathematics has the power to generate reality. But of course, we can get into a lot more detail by understanding Fourier mathematics and wave mechanics. So we'd have to understand exactly how mathematics forms itself into frequency patterns, and then how these frequency patterns are able to combine to create the wave structure that generates reality. Because reality is simply a wave structure that is composed of constituent mathematical frequency patterns of the source. And these are fundamental. They are the essence and ground of reality. A way to think about it is you could imagine the fundamental structure of reality. Think of the fundamental structure of reality as like a piano. Well, what happens if you play the piano? A song is produced. The song depends on the frequencies of the piano to exist. If you got rid of the piano, the song wouldn't be there anymore. It would stop. So likewise, physical reality is like the song of the source. It's the song of the frequency domain. The frequency domain, the source, contains all the fundamental frequency patterns, all the fundamental frequencies, all the fundamental sinusoids necessary to create complex frequency functions that can then be transformed to space-time information and generate all reality and generate all existence. So when we ask the question, did God create the universe? If you want to you could call that God. You could, if you wanted to, call the source God. And then you could say, yes, God created the universe, but it's done in an unconscious way, not consciously. And what I mean by that is, see, that's another thing some might ask. Well, who arranged those mathematical patterns? Remember, we're using logic and reason again. Rationally speaking, motion is inherently embedded within the structure of mathematics. Motion logically has to exist within the structure of mathematics when we're understanding this through the lens of logic and reason. Now, why is that the case? Again, I could do hours and hours on this, but in a nutshell, it's because motion does not violate any rules of reason as long as that motion behaves in a rational way. And a cyclical pattern is a pattern that behaves in a rational way. So in other words, the only possible pattern that motion can occur in is either stillness or no motion, or a cyclical pattern, a circle, because a circle is a perfect pattern where every point is treated with exact uniformity and equality. There's no arbitrary motion. It is a perfect pattern. So either there's only two possibilities, cyclical motion or no motion at all. Well, no motion at all doesn't result in anything. So we can just ignore that. But cyclical motion results in sinusoidal waves because mathematically speaking, as soon as you have a cyclical pattern, you have a sinusoidal pattern because they go together. It's two different ways of looking at the same information. A circle can be expressed as sinusoidal waves. Then as soon as you have sinusoidal waves, these sinusoidal waves can combine to create complex functions, intricate waveforms, and has the power to then generate all reality, all existence. So long story short, motion is embedded within the logic of mathematics, and this motion allows it to inherently take on the various transformations that exist within it as potentialities that then get translated into the physical world that we experience. So, God doesn't need to be there to arrange the mathematics into a certain pattern. Remember, we're using logic and reason to unveil what is true, and logic and reason shows that mathematics inherently within itself has the ability to have its own internal motion because there's nothing about that that breaks the rules of logic and reason. It is totally and completely valid. And we could go much further than this by showing that every single one of us is an eternal mathematical being. That is beyond the scope of this video. But we could continue. You see how we are able to unfold these logical conclusions as we follow the rationale behind it. We're able to further conclude that we are eternal mathematical beings. And thus it is our frequencies that form all reality. And guess what that means? We created reality. God didn't create reality. We created reality. Or alternatively, we are God. So if you want to say God created the universe, sure, but we are God. And this just means that reality is mathematically generated. And we are the source of those mathematical patterns. Now, I didn't give the full explanation of how we got there. Like I said, that would take hours and hours and hours to get to how we know that we are mathematical beings. But again, like following the logic, you can show that it has to be the case that mathematics, in the terms of sinusoidal waves, are structured into minds, sentient, subjective, experiencing minds, and thus we are beings of frequencies, and the combination of frequencies that form all reality come from us. Thus, reality is created from our internal frequencies. All reality is generated by our internal frequencies. And so reality is generated by us as God, but in an unconscious process. Now, why is it unconscious? So I want to say reality is cyclical, or universal cycles do exist. In the end of this physical universe, there will be a beginning of another one, and on and on and on and on and on. However, what's important to understand is that behind the scenes, there's always an immaterial reality that contains the information and coding facilitating this. In scientific materialist theories, even ones that contain the idea of there being cyclical universes, they don't have the immaterial aspect there underpinning it. That's why there's a lot of problems with those theories. Remember in Multiverse how we had a ton of problems in Multiverse or in quantum mechanics when we tried to deny the immaterial? You got infinity universes. Well, there are equally problems in cyclical theories of reality when you try to say reality is material. But there are no problems when you underpin it by an immaterial mathematical reality that contains the coding and the structure that allows this to take place. So behind the scenes, there's always that immaterial realm, which is where we are actually located, by the way. We aren't actually located inside of space and time as eternal minds. We exist in the frequency domain. We just have the experience of being in the space-time domain because we are interfacing with avatars that through our senses give us space-time information that give us the experience of having a localized existence in the physical reality, or what we call the holos. It's kind of like putting on a VR headset. When you put on a VR headset, it seems like you're in the VR world, but you're not really. You're just getting the information. Same thing. We, as eternal minds, always exist in the immaterial realm, the frequency domain, but we have the experience of existing in the physical holos because of interfacing with these avatars that give us a localized existence. And so the reason that this happens is because we're on a process of evolution. We're mathematical beings, so we go through transformations. And as we get to our pinnacle of evolution, we start to operate as one mind. And at the very end of space, at the very end of time, we are operating such in sync that it's as though we are one mind. There's multiplicity of minds, but it's as though we are one mind because we are just so in sync with each other. But think about how horrifying that would be for a minute. Think about if you were the only mind in existence. For a minute, that might be cool because you could do whatever you want. But after you have fun and do everything you want, that would turn into hell. You would be think about the loneliness, think about the isolation, think about the existential crisis. You would be the only mind in existence. That would become hell. So this is precisely why we, as the absolute, as a collective mind, decide to fracture ourselves into a multiplicity of viewpoints again, so that we have the opportunity to go through this evolutionary story again and play this game of life together in this unfolding journey that we're all taking part in and that we're all creating together. And why does any of this matter? The reason why this matters is because it provides the understanding that we are the masters of our own fate, that we literally created this universe, and so it's up to us to transform it. If you believe that a monotheistic God exists, well, what happens then? You're either trying to get to heaven, which doesn't exist, or you're waiting for some savior to come and make everything better. You're looking for answers that are outside of you or outside of us. But the truth is that everything is within. Know thyself and you will know the universe and the gods, because you are the universe and the gods. So when you make that realization, when we collectively make the realization that we are God and we are responsible for the universe, then we can begin creating the world in our image. We can begin creating the kingdom of heaven on earth right here and now. And what that means is raising consciousness, introducing reason, creating empathy, and creating structures of unity so that we can finally move on to the next phase of existence where we're no longer mired in all this division and hatred and sexism and racism and violence, and instead are collaborating together and cooperating together as we realize that, hey, we are all just different perspectives, different viewpoints of a network coming to know itself and understand itself through us. So my friends, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to know more about this, there are 2 other videos that I did that I think would help. One of them is called Proofs for God's Existence Are Not What You Think. And the other one is Mathematics. Does Mathematics Prove God's Existence? So those 2 videos would help if you want to know more about this. But that being said, once again, if you really want to know all the details about this, highly recommend The New Science of Mind, Meta-Rationalism. So check that out. Link is in the description of this video. And if you're new to all this information, start with the first book, Neogenesis. But if you're ready to dive into the explanation to reality, all existence, and your eternal essence, that's the one to do it. All right, my friends, please make sure you like and subscribe. And if you want to help my channel grow, help me reach more people, please become a member. You can become a member on Patreon or right here on YouTube. Hit the join button on YouTube to see all the different tiers and all the different perks you get. There's a lot of great stuff. You get access to all of our members only videos. There's a new one every week. We're having a members only video right after this called Can Fate and Free Will Both Exist? As we explore fate, free will, determinism, predeterminism, and a lot more quantum mechanics as well. You can get access to our Discord server where we have weekly Neogenian classes and study groups on Sundays. Anyway, just hit the join button, check it out. It helps out a lot and I appreciate it very much. I want to give a big shout out to everyone who supports, especially Renaissance Fairy, Cassidy, Angela, DB, Nusalina, Christopher, Eon, and Vanessa. Thank you very much.